Hey guys, welcome back to the third video. Today we're going to be looking at a YouTube tutorial from a channel called the Fundamentals of Engineering Exam. They're just a FE exam prep channel that kind of covers all of the general mathematics, statistics, physics that are going to be applicable across all of the exams. Today's focus is going to be on quadratic equations. So let's listen in.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? It's Justin Dickmeyer with EngineeringTrainingExam.com, and in today's quick tutorial we're going to review quadratic equations. We'll start off with this tutorial by defining a quadratic equation. We'll move on to solving quadratic equations using factoring. Then we'll move on to the quadratic formula and finish off with defining the discriminant. So what is a quadratic equation? In its simplest form, a quadratic equation is ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0, where a cannot equal 0. So in other terms, a quadratic equation must have squared term as its highest power. So how do we solve quadratic equations? There are four methods of solving these equations. One, we can factor. Two, completing the square. Factor by grouping, or using the quadratic formula. In this tutorial, in this quick review, we're going to talk about factoring and the quadratic formula. So a quadratic equation can be solved by factoring if, after writing that equation in its standard form, the quadratic expression factors. Completing this process can be done in 4 steps. Step number 1 is getting an equation. We want to simplify it. We want to take away any parentheses, division. We want to add like terms. Once simplified, we want to get that equation into the standard form of ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0. Step number 3, factor. Once we have a factor, we want to solve. So that's all. Let's look at a quick example. Let's take the equation x squared plus 3x minus 10 is equal to 0. So the first step is to simplify. That's completed. Step number 2, we want to get in its standard form. Once again, convenient. That's completed. Step number 3, we want to factor. So in this case, this equation factors out to x plus 5 multiplied by x minus 2 is equal to 0. So we want this product to equal to 0. So in step number 4, we need to solve that, and we can just visualize and see that we're going to get x is equal to negative 5 and x is equal to 2. So this quadratic equation has 2 solutions: x equal negative 5 and x equal 2. So let's talk about the quadratic formula. You can solve any quadratic equation by using the quadratic formula. This is convenient when a quadratic equation does not factor or is difficult to factor. So once again, there's 4 steps, or excuse me, there's 5 steps in completing this process. Step number 1 is, given an equation, we want to simplify just like that previous factoring. We want to get rid of any parentheses, division. We want to get rid of or combine like terms. Step number 2 is the same as well. We want to get it into standard form. So once it's in standard form of ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0, we can move on to step number 3, which is we need to identify what a is equal, what b is equal, and what c is equal. Once we identify what a, b, and c is, we can take the quadratic formula, which is x is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac divided by 2a. So we just take our values of a, b, and c and we plug them into this equation. And then step number 5 would be whatever those values are, if we can simplify and make them complete whole numbers, and that's great. Let's do that. So once again, let's look at a quick example. Let's take the equation 2x squared minus 5x plus 1 is equal to 0. Once again, step number 1 of simplifying is done. Step number 2 of getting it in its standard form is completed. Step number 3, in this case, a is equal to 2, b is equal to -5, and c is equal to 1. Step number 4, we take the quadratic formula and populate it. So in this instance, we're going to go minus of -5 plus or minus the square root of -5 squared minus 4 times 2 times 1, and that's all over 2 times 2. So let's move up here. Now that we have all of our values for a, b, and c plugged into the quadratic formula, we can solve, and we get x is equal to 5 plus or minus the square root of 25 minus 8 divided by 4. And this doesn't simplify into whole numbers or anything, but we can simplify it a little bit as x is equal to 5 plus or minus the square root of 17 divided by 4. So those are our two solutions for this quadratic equation. So let's talk about the discriminant. When we're given an equation or a quadratic equation, ax squared, once again, bx plus c is equal to 0. Right off the bat, we can take a look at it and know if we can define a, b, and c, we can define the discriminant. And if we can define the discriminant, then we can use a couple known factors to determine what our solutions are going to look like to this equation. So in other words, let me define it like this. The discriminant in the quadratic formula is that under the square root of the quadratic formula on the top, which is b squared minus 4ac. So we have all these defined in a given quadratic equation, and if we do, we can determine what type of solutions we should expect to see. So, in other words, we can put this into a table. Say we define our discriminant, and that discriminant is less than 0. If it's less than 0, then there are going to be two distinct real number answers, solutions to that quadratic equation. If that discriminant is equal to 0, then there's going to be one real number solution. If that discriminant is greater than 0, then there's going to be two distinct complex imaginary number solutions. So that's it. So the discriminant, once again, the quadratic equation, minus b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac divided by 2a. This right here, that's the discriminant. So once we get a quadratic equation, we can determine what the value is of that discriminant, take it to our table, and know what to expect when we determine our solutions. So that's that quick overview of quadratic equations. I appreciate you guys checking out the YouTube channel. Don't forget to head back over to engineeringtrainingexam.com.
Excellent. So, basically the major points let's see here. There we go. Basically the major points that I gleaned from it was you've got factoring, the quadratic formula, and discriminant. for you you can use factoring or the quadratic formula to solve a standard form differential equation. The first thing you have to do is break your equation down into the standard form, and that's going to be using derivatives that we'll learn about later on. Then for factoring, you would use the factoring method to break out the standard form into an x plus something, and then an x times an x minus something to get your solutions. Or if you get to the standard form, you can apply the quadratic formula, negative b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a, and you can just plug in your numbers and solve your quadratic equation. And there's kind of the discriminant is the solution that comes out of b squared minus 4ac, and basically what it can do is tell you ahead of time how many answers you're going to get and whether they're going to be real or imaginary. So that was the summation of my notes. I know this is going to be a shorter video today, but the goal was to build a routine, and we're definitely 1 week down into getting that started. So let's see if we can keep it up again next week. Thank you and goodbye.